Hello, once again. Welcome back to another episode of The Contrarians. This is going to be another one of our regular shows. You know, I like doing these regular ones. It anchors the concept. We have so many of these strange, panels that we're doing all the time. But yeah, this is a regular one where we've got a guest and we're talking about a certain album of that guest finds the greatest of the catalog, or certainly really high in the catalog, and it's a somewhat contrarian choice. We have Ralph Chapman back again. How are you doing this morning?
Guten Morgen. Sehr gut.
Yes, good,
yeah.
Good. Ralph, of course, was with us for Peter Gabriel Scratch 2, and Pink Floyd, The Final Cut, and those were very well received episodes. Ralph does an amazing job on these, so we thought we'd have him back for a third time. Third time's a charm, and we are talking about Robert Plant today. And Ralph is going to be talking about, I'll let the cat out of the bag. Well, he did already, Shaken and Stirred. There's my copy of it. And essentially, so he's going to argue for this record as a great album. Came out May 20th, 1985, almost 2 years after the previous album, which was The Principle of Moments. And I've gone on record on various shows, and I've said this for years. I've been known to call that album for a good 20 years on and off my favorite album of all time by anybody. Principle of Moments. Pretty strange,
wow.
Eh? Yeah, I know. And I quite like the first one. And well, we'll talk a little bit later about what consensus is out there, as we always do on The Contrarians. This album's produced by Robert Plant with Tim Palmer and Benji Lefebvre. And Tim Palmer was just getting his career started. He was like 20 years old, not really producing much at this point, but moves on to like Mighty Lemon Drops and the Mission, things like that. So this is his third record, Robert Plant's third record. It did go gold right away. More or less driven by a pretty conventional song on it, a hit single called Little by Little. He's on his own label at this point, like Zeppelin had Swan Song. He's got this Esperanza. And then after this, it was the Now and Zen album, which did really well for him. And that's 2.5 years later again. So quite a big gap in this. This album went to number 19 on the UK charts, number 20 in the US. We've got Robert Plant, Robbie Blunt on guitar again, who was on the first two. Of course, he's doing things quite differently on this one, essentially guided by the boss and his new mandate of what he wants for this record. Paul Martinez on bass, a lot of big, important bass licks and riffs and bass structures on this album. Jez Woodruff back again on keyboards. Jez, interesting guy. He was with Sabbath as well on the Never Say Die album. Richie Hayward on drums from Little Feat. We're going to talk a little bit more about him later. And then some female vocals, Tony Halliday, some female vocals here and there as well. But yeah, that's sort of your rundown of this record. Well, actually, I'll mention a couple more things. The debut went gold immediately, platinum in 90. The second one went platinum right away. Now and Zen went platinum right away, but up into 2001, that record, Now and Zen, is certified 3 times platinum. So that was a huge success for him. Fate of Nations went gold immediately, 1993. That's a well-regarded album. And then he's got many, many albums after that, and none of them have certified. He's gone into this sort of archival, old-timey music thing to generalize somewhat. Very, very exploratory, but he is on this as well, at which we're going to hear from Ralph. So I'm going to turn this over to Ralph. Tell us about this shocking album and why you like it.
Shocking album.
Yes.
Yeah. Why is this album awesome? Yeah. Okay. So thanks again, Martin, for having me on. It's a pleasure to talk about these records, especially these records from my youth. I mean, I was 19 when that came out. And I bought it on the release day back then because I had been following his career since I was probably too young in many ways for Led Zeppelin. And in the early 80s, I discovered, first it was Beatles, but then I went into this whole prog thing and became enamored with the drums, and specifically Phil Collins. So I remember waking up to go to school. I guess it would have been grade 11, and you'd have the alarm come on with the radio, and the song that came on was Burning Down One Side. So this is the 82, and I instantly recognized that was Phil's drums, unmistakable playing, and tom sound and everything else. And that kind of awakened my interest in Robert Plant and then Led Zeppelin, and that's what got me into Robert Plant through Phil Collins, which is probably a very strange road for a lot of people out there, a lot of listeners, but that's how it went. And so, and then a year later, Principle of Moments came out, and I share your extreme passion for that record. And again, it was mostly Phil on drums with Barrymore Barlow, one of the greatest drummers ever to pick up the sticks, in my opinion. And then Robert came to Toronto with Phil on drums in, I think it was September of 83. So I was right there. I got tickets right above the drum kit. I'm going to get to Shaken and Stirred, but this is a little context for what is maybe quite an unorthodox view about this record. And I was in heaven for that show. And I at the same time, I had bought up the Led Zeppelin catalog. So I was all in with Robert and Led Zeppelin at that point. So, and that was seeing Robert with Phil on that Principle of Moments tour was kind of that was the apex of my love for him. So I couldn't wait for the next record to come out. And one thing I'm not sure if you did mention, but what did come out was that EP, the Honey Drippers, Sea of Love, Rockin' at Midnight, things like that were on that record. And for me, immediately I knew there was no Phil. And of course, pre-internet, you do some research, and it seemed like Paul Schaefer was involved, and maybe Ahmet Ertegun, and people. I obviously knew who Paul Schaefer was, but it was such a huge departure from Principle of Moments. The record really, really confused me. And he showed up on SNL, and it was like my parents' music. It was the Quiet Generation, even though it was probably just skirting the line of Boomer and Quiet Generation, but it was not what I was interested in, what Robert was doing, and I wasn't mature enough. Of course, now you listen to Honey Drippers, and it's exquisitely produced and played, and you respect it and you understand it. But at the time, I was baffled by it, so I didn't know where he was going to go at that point. And so what happened is, come 1985, and I'd heard the rumors of a new album was coming out, and I knew Phil wasn't going to be on it, which was a drag. And Richie Hayward was going to be the new drummer, who I didn't know who Little Feat was, and I certainly didn't know who Richie Hayward was when I was 19. And in many ways, that's the joy of being 19, is you're just discovering these things. So the record comes out, and the first thing, like probably a lot of people out there, fans of Robert Plant and Led Zeppelin, and I always got, just to digress for a second, I may have been one of the few people who liked Robert Plant's solo at that point as much as Led Zeppelin. So I used to get a lot of friction at high school for that. It's like, oh, it's somehow derivative because Jimmy and John Paul weren't there, and obviously John Bonham wasn't there. But to me, it was all one narrative. And Led Zeppelin itself, to me, because I again, as I said, got to Led Zeppelin through progressive rock, I saw Led Zeppelin as a progressive rock band. I didn't see them as a hard rock band or a blues rock band. I saw them as progressive, which still rankles the odd person. It's kind of like Rush. I see Rush as a prog rock band, but man, do I get, in trouble from a lot of fans out there who they're not. Alex has said it. Anyway, I digress. But anyway, it was all one beautiful melange with Robert Plant back then. So the album comes out. I knew it wasn't going to have Phil, and I put it on my parents' old Electrohome stereo. And the first thing is Hip to Who, first track. And there's a female vocalist, and there's a huge swath of synthesizers. And I knew this was going to be a record that was going to confuse me, my 19-year-old mind. And I have to admit, I listened to it maybe 3 or 4 times at that point, and it left me completely alienated. To me, it had nothing to do, well, it had nothing to do with the Honey Drippers, which was good, but I could not hear a continuity at that point in my life, in my young life, between Pictures at 11, Principle of Moments, and this. It had sort of the earmarks of at least Principle of Moments in the sense that it was, I knew immediately, even on that stereo, the production was out of this world. It was so huge sounding. And it wasn't just the kind of reverb on the drums. It was how those songs were recorded, how they were layered and arranged, and etc. And so I scanned the credits, and this Tim Palmer was there, who I didn't know, but I assumed that he was a huge part of this not new sound, but more evolved, to be generous about it, more evolved sound. And so now a lot of what I'm going to say is in retrospect, because much like the final cut, this record was not immediate for me. It was like, the one record I think of is Paul McCartney's Pipes of Peace, is another record that I almost hated. And then I evolved, started to understand what kind of artists I like and what they tended to do through their career, which is make changes. Not that Pipes of Peace necessarily is a reflection of that, but it's a off the wall record in terms of one that is largely loathed by the populace, but one where its charms revealed itself later in life. So, Robert, now we're going back to 1985 again. Though the album did very little for me, I went to the tour, and I gotta say, it was the loudest. It was at the CNE Stadium, and they opened with "In the Mood." I remember that. And again, I didn't know much about Richie Hayward. All I knew was he didn't play "In the Mood" like Phil had played it at the Gardens and on the record. It was I don't know. It wasn't as good in my mind. So, and then Jez Woodruff did this keyboard solo that was so loud, I have to tell you, so loud that the blood ran down my face. I was in about 14th row floors, and that place just shook. So, and it was painful. It was almost negligent in my mind. They had that thing so loud. Too loud, obviously, to coin a phrase. So that was part of that whole shaken and stirred experience for me. It was disappointing. It was married to a concert that wasn't as good as the Gardens September '83 show with Phil. It had a woman singing on it. It had all these baffling elements that were just alienating for me. So you would have thought a few years later, and I'll get to this, when Now and Zen came out, that I would have been relieved. But what Now and Zen did within my mind, and so now I'm 22 when that comes out, and I've developed quite a bit. I think my ears and yes. And the cover, I'll talk about the cover of that a bit. Perhaps I should have been excited. And I should say that maybe my subconscious or unconscious was reminding me, but I don't know if I've mentioned this in previous times I've appeared on your show, but I was one of those kids, crazy teenagers, who I was sitting with my friends watching Johnny Carson one night, July 11th, 1985. And we look at each other because the news is broke that Led Zeppelin is, as much as they can, reforming at Live Aid. And Phil was going to be one of the drummers. So we got my friend's Mazda GLC, and we drove down to Philadelphia and picked up some scalper tickets, and we went to Live Aid, ostensibly to see Robert with Jimmy and John Paul. And Paul Martinez, as I found out it's pronounced. Who knew? I always thought it was Martinez. Apparently Martinez. Anyway, so I won't go on. Live Aid is a totally separate story, disconnected, shaken, stirred. But the main thing is I waited in the hot Philadelphia sun. And then finally, this reformation takes place. And this is an entirely different episode, of course, because Jimmy has come out and slammed the performance. And, and he seems to be not right through that performance. But it was one of the greatest things I'd ever seen. That 3 or 4 song set. I think they did Stairway and Whole Lot of Love and Rock and Roll. But the interesting thing about that for me is, as much as I was elated, I had a sense of, because Paul Martinez was on the stage, Martinez was on the stage, I missed Robert's solo band. Part of me didn't like him going back to the past. Even though I didn't detect any of the poor performances or anything like that, I thought it sounded absolutely fantastic. And they had Tony Thompson with him as well. There's still a part of me that thought, this is a nostalgia trip. And I was 19 and it was a dream come true to see those guys, but at the same time, not to belabor the point. It's like, okay, I wish they'd do this. And then Robbie Blunt would come on and Jez would come on and maybe Bob Mayo would come on. And Richie obviously would come on, and then they do. So it was a strange and very subtle, but I remember thinking that. So that just meant for me that somewhere in my mind, I knew I was going to return to Shaken and Stirred, that that there was part of me that thought, it's probably part me that I don't get it. Because when I've talked to you, probably much to your chagrin, I started out as a Beatles fan. And when you're a Beatles fan, you embrace a band that changed dramatically, especially once they got going around Help right through to Abbey Road. They reinvented themselves every single album. And that was one of the most, even, 15, 16 years after they'd broken up, I was still astonished they were the ultimate progressive rock band to me. And they never cared what the audience thought. So as much as Shaken and Stirred didn't speak to me, I respected it. I respected what I was hearing. And I grew to respect the Honey Drippers, which was kind of a novelty project. But I started to see Robert more and more as a guy that, again, thinking about Live Aid and the aftermath of that, as a guy who was a progressive artist. And Live Aid was an anomaly that I didn't really like. So I returned to it. I returned to Shaken and Stirred, probably, like I said, right after Now and Zen came out, which I did not like. I didn't like, and it wasn't just because he was sampling it and seemed to be tripping on the sort of burgeoning hip hop thing, or it struck me as a poorer version and I won't say sellout, but there just struck me as something about it that was, and I'm not going to litigate this record, but it just felt like a cash in. It felt like the first time Robert had, and even though it seems modern and, again, the record called Now and Zen, it reaches for the present and looks to the past. And if you look at Shaken and Stirred's record cover, and which I'll talk about a bit later, I loved it. I thought it was a very interesting cover in the fact that he wasn't on it, that the statement was, this is something that you got to get into, that I'm not handing you the personality of Robert Plant. And on the back cover, of course, even that, it's out of focus. It's not obscured, but it doesn't have the same kind of uber cool former frontman Zeppelin vibe to it. But really the cover, which I think he was part of the concept of, drew me in. And then when Now and Zen came out, and had this very, in my mind, he was back to having the big long hair, and he's front and center, and It's like, oh, you're selling yourself no longer as a progressive artist. You're selling yourself as a heritage artist, even though I didn't know the words back then. No matter what was on that record, the good stuff reminded me is not as good as Shaken and Stirred. And the stuff I didn't like struck me as pandering or nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. And then he went off, actually. I think the next album was Manic Nirvana. And I saw these tours. And the other thing about Shaken and Stirred is you saw the tour. Yeah, he might do the odd Elvis song, but he stuck to his guns in terms of I'm a new artist. I'm not going to do Led Zeppelin songs. And that I had maybe this is related to the Live Aid story, but I really respected that we weren't going to get versions of Black Dog or whatever song you want to pull. It was about being Robert Plant. When I went to the Gardens show for Now and Zen, he brought out Black Country Woman, and he might have even done, I don't know whether he did Black Dog, but he had 2 or 3 in the evening. He may have even opened that show with. And I remember, again, this sense of, on one level, it's neat to see these songs, but on another level, it was, oh, well, that guy I loved who had left Led Zeppelin and left, John Bonham had passed and he was determined to reinvent himself, was now trading on something that I thought was a little beneath him. And I don't know if that's a contrary point of view. So again, it was Now and Zen, and I went back to Shaken and Stirred as a much more evolved. By then I had gotten into Talk Talk and Midure and a whole bunch of other British, I almost would say post-new wave, Joe Jackson, a lot of artists that altered what I thought a record could do and sound like. And then you go back to Shaken and Stirred, and all of a sudden you marvel at, you may admire or think, well, this is a pretty impressive production, but all of a sudden the whole record was had a new sound to me, and I was ready for it. I was excited by it. So this again would be 88, 89. And that's where I've stayed with Shaken and Stirred. And now, because I'm on this show, it's become a very, very, it looms large in my music loving life. And not because of nostalgia. I don't think about being 19 or 20 or 21 when I put this record on. I think about how the 80s, in my mind, was the last, at the risk of sounding dramatic, it was the last great era for production. Many of the artists that I loved, contrary to the popular notion that they were kind of lost in the 80s, like, oh, they were actually, and again, I bring up Paul McCartney because he was like this too. When he brought out Press to Play a year after Shaken and Stirred, he got just slayed for that album. And it was him chasing and blah, blah, blah. And I posit that it wasn't him chasing. It was doing what he did, like Robert did with Shaken and Stirred, which is embracing the side of that artist that was their artistry that was always restless, always interested in moving forward. You think about that leap from Led Zeppelin 4 to House of the Holy. And yeah, there's a lot, Jimmy's obviously a huge part of that, and John Paul and John. But to me, sonically, the type of songs, the humor that runs through some of House of the Holy with Jamaica and the grunge was such a huge evolution. And that's how I felt with Press to Play, Paul McCartney's 86 album. And that's what I think of with Shaken and Stirred, it was for me the last time he was a rock artist, a progressive rock artist. Now, I love his whole catalog now because everything gets better, I find, as I get older. It's one of the few things I enjoy about aging is you open up. So all of a sudden, choices artists you love make that you didn't really connect to, you understand. Hopefully your reference is expanded. And anyway, so the album itself, what I started to recognize was the whole approach to this record was entirely different than the previous ones. And a lot of that had to do with a few factors. And I say all of this with admiration. One, Richie Hayward. So the first two records, my understanding, and I remember chatting with Jason Bonham about this, and I've since read interviews with Phil Collins, and I've interviewed Paul Martin as well for a book I want to write on Phil Collins. And those first two records, Pictures and Principles, were done with Jason or with drum machines, with always the intent that either Barrymore or Cozy or Phil would replace those parts. And I know with Phil, with Pictures at 11, he did all that work on that record. So 6, I think, of the 8 tracks in 3 days. So he was sent tapes, listened to the tapes, listened to whatever Jason was doing, and came up with his own parts. With Principled Moments, he had 5 days, I think. Same kind of modus, though, listening to pretty developed demos and then just putting his imprimatur on these songs. And of course, I loved it. And certainly Phil was at a zenith then. But, you know, as far as putting an album together, Robert didn't have a full-time band, although obviously Robbie had been there, and Jez and Paul had been there from the beginning. When you bring in a drummer right from the start, that's going to change the record, especially someone as gifted as Richie Hayward was. This guy from Iowa who was, again, capable of so many different styles and feels and grooves, not just with Little Feat, which was actually, I realized in my 30s, was quite a progressive band. I thought they were some sort of Southern hick band, but they were not. And I recommend people exploring the Little Feat catalog, and at least until Lowell George passed on. I don't know much about that. Anyway, I'm all over the place, so forgive me. That is one of the things that I love about Shaken and Stirred is it's a band album. Drummer right out of the gate, there to develop the material with the other guys. And there is a sense, I feel, when I listen to that record of the bass player and the drummer connecting in a way that was absent from the first two records. Doesn't mean it wasn't fabulous, but there's something completely unique in Shaken and Stirred and how the rhythm section operates. I'll get to that later because there's certain songs where you really, really hear that. Okay, so they got Richie. He's there from the beginning. They're ostensibly, musically, the songwriting credits have changed. If you scan that record, I think this is really important. And I think I remember reading interviews, promo stuff that Robert did, junkets and things, that Jez Woodruff had a greater role on this record from a compositional point of view than the past two. And you scan the credits and you can see that while he did, I think he co-wrote 3 tunes on, I think he got credits on 3, this is from memory, bear with me, 3 on Pictures at 11 and 3 on Principle of Moments. This album, he's got 6 writing credits. And I don't think that's just Robert becoming more liberal with how he bestowed credits, because I had heard from Paul Martinez that he was pretty egalitarian that way. He wasn't cheap with offering up credits. But obviously all you have to do is listen to that record and hear Jez's huge influence. And I think at the same time, so you've got this band, and at the same time, you've got Robert, who's, in my mind, still pushing forward. Pushing forward. But again, this is in retrospect. I'd heard that maybe he'd finally left his wife at this point. He was a single guy. He was restless professionally, but he was restless personally and grappling. And plus, as every era seems to be, but the mid 80s, again, I think of people like McCartney and Plant, was a inhospitable time for them. I think they were looked on as heritage acts before we really knew what heritage acts were. And I think it affects those guys. I remember reading interviews. Eric Clapton was doing the same thing, and he brought in Phil Collins to produce a couple of records that people hate that I think are the best of his career. Side story. But I think that was affecting Robert Plant. Right back to Principle of Moments interviews, and you can read this, and I'm sure you read it, Martin. He didn't want to be written off as an old fart at 34 was one of his quotes. I think he was going through that as well, which is, you're an artist, Martin, an accomplished writer, and a lot of where you go is with these classic rock, for lack of a better, though I loathe that expression, or heritage. You're also a very accomplished artist, painter. It's very, very, and I've, done my share of writing docs and things like that. It's very, very hard to be accepted outside of, if you ever want to go to new places. That's something also I learned acutely as I got older and respected Shaken and Stirred for. Anyway, he struck me as a guy, in retrospect, as a guy in tumult, artistic tumult, personal tumult, and that fed through this record. The irony of that, of course, is in many ways, this is his most poppy record, for lack of a better word, happiest, most up record. Tony Halliday, which is another key factor in why I love this record, was just completely altered the mood of Shaken and Stirred, and gave him a sound that was completely fresh to me and new. And I hate using those kind of cheap descriptors, but first of all, if you scan the credits, Tony gets a lead credit. Like, he doesn't bury her as a guest. She's up there with Jez and Paul and Robbie, and I think he gives her a additional vocals credit. Yeah. So she's almost a de facto part of the band, though she doesn't stay and doesn't tour. And when I read that, especially when I went back to it, I went, "Oh, this is profound." In one's little, freaky, geeky music world, when you return to things, you look for ways to understand what an artist is doing. And that hit me in a way that didn't hit me when I was 19, is that's a statement. I took that as a statement. This person is an integral part of what this record is going to sound like. And as soon as the record started, she's there, cooing and, cheat, cheat, don't do it now. And bringing an element and a sonic angle, or whatever you want to call it, to a record that was, that Robert hadn't explored meaningfully before. And she was an accomplished singer, a contralto, I think she is. And again, it gave it a place to go, Shaken and Stirred, but it also infused it with a levity and a dreaminess and a euphoria that hadn't appeared before. It had somewhat appeared on Zeppelin songs, but on his first two records, there was not a crunch to it, because especially Principle of Moments goes all over the place on that record. But there was moods on this record that he hadn't explored before. And a lot of that was Tony, and a lot of that was Jez. And Jez got into early sampling. I was reading an interview with him recently, actually, an interview from about 86, where he talks about, for Too Loud, he was getting into early sampling, and he sampled the Nelson Riddle Orchestra, I think, for that, which has these strange orchestral stabs. And then, of course, it made sense when I read that. Oh, that's what I'm hearing when I put on these biodynamic M-iron headphones, which make this record sound beautiful. And you listen to Too Loud. And again, there's so much going on, but one of the things that was going on was this early sampling. So that didn't exist. With Principle, clearly he was evolving. And I know that record, Robert was exploring Simmons drums and getting Phil and Barry to play Simmons drums, which in part makes that a progressive sounding record. But here he went whole hog. And with Richie, and I'll probably repeat this too much, Richie was a guy, again, in the same Jazz Woodruff interview I read, I don't even remember, it was some keyboard publication. He talks about how Richie was a pretty nuts and bolts kind of player, acoustic kit kind of player. And it was Jez saying, well, for this album, go buy a Linn drum, which is an early drum machine that I think it's a Linn drum on Genesis Mama. And it was a staple of the early to mid 80s. And with the idea that you're going to have to expand your palette, and what Richie does on this record. And if you're a drummer, this record is one of the greatest records I've ever heard, at least in the rock idiom. How he seamlessly, on one track, I think it's Hip to Who, but Kalalu, I think it's called as well. A lot of those songs, Richie Hayward seamlessly plays an acoustic kit, plays Simmons drums, plays percussion. Now, some of this may have been overdubbed, but the way the Simmons drum and the acoustic drums layer into each other, again, Phil Collins is one of the few other people, and Neil from Rush did this as well. But I think this is one of the most beautiful presentations of acoustic and electronic percussion ever laid on a record. Again, it just shifts the flavor and the mood and the energy of that record constantly through a song. It's really, really quite something. And where he chooses, or where Robert or Tim or Benji or the band in their arrangement chose to switch up sometimes in mid verse what he's going to do. Again, just on that level, this record is so fascinating to me. And that's just one tiny element. So to recap, you got Richie coming on, being part of the writing process. You got Jez exploring, given much more breadth to work artistically. And he's much more there as a writer. And he's into all these early for then keyboard, very progressive keyboard voicings and things like that. And that's all just really, really exciting, extremely exciting, especially when you return to it. And I've never bought into, maybe some people out there are saying, well, because you hear this a lot, oh, the 80s are about reverb, they're about gated drums, they're about crappy keyboard sounds. And again, I've always resisted that, much like when this is what I listened to last night. Frank Sinatra, Strangers in the Night. Doesn't sound dated. Sonny Payne on drums, Sonny Burke production. It just sounds fantastic. It just sounds like these guys knew what they were doing. And that's how, again, Tim Palmer, Benji, and Robert, they just knew how to record. They knew how to, whether it was in the mixing, how they created the stereo picture, maybe it was mic placement, choice of instrument. Some of this record and what makes it sound so alive, it seems close mic'd, meaning the mic is very close to the instruments or the amplifiers, or it sounds like it's been plugged in direct right into the mixing, whatever the case is. And again, I think about the Beatles and Revolution, how they got that guitar sound is they just went straight into the desk. I think Jimmy did this as well. It's revolutionary. How do you make a recording sound like you're at a concert, where it's just so visceral and dragging you in? And that's what I thought Tim and Benji and Robert did with Shaken and Stirred. So back to Tony Holiday. The interesting thing to me about Tony now in retrospect is the last time, and people can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the last time he had used or sung with a woman was the Battle of Evermore when Sandy Denny. So that to me, again, as a fan, says a lot in terms of how far afield Robert had gone and how exciting that was. Because the last time he used was 71, when he used Sandy on this Celtic kind of brooding Tolkien tune with mandolins, and what's the refrain she sings, Dance in the Dark of Night, and Sing to the Morning Light, which is so different from, and I'm getting to the point, which is so different from what Tony was doing, which again is, oh, cheat sheet, don't do it now. Like just an entirely different approach to these kinds of textures. And if you think about it, as I encourage everyone to listen to Shaken and Stirred with a new and broader mind, there's only 14 years that separate Led Zeppelin 4 and Shaken and Stirred. If you explore, say, the Foo Fighters catalog, and you go from their first record to 14 years later, and you put those two records on, and yeah, I love Taylor Hawkins, so no disrespect to Taylor. The amount of, and they're different bands, obviously, but it just reminds me of what music, which sounds like the old man thing, but it's just a fact to me. The progression and the career that Robert had in those 14 years. I can put on Led Zeppelin 4 and then I can put on Shaken and Stirred and marvel at this journey that, because when I listen to Led Zeppelin 4, I still think it's one of the most extraordinary records. And that's incredibly intoxicating for me to hear an artist progress like that. And hearing, and where I key into that is Sandy versus Tony and what Robert's doing. So that's that. You know, back then, mainstream artists, heritage artists, for the most part, seemed to be driven by progression, that they had to do it. They were obliged to do it. I don't really hear that. I don't hear that now. And there's a lot of reasons why you don't hear that. It's the fall of the A&R guy. It's the fall of great management. It's shifting tastes. I was interviewing a guy named Jim Leverton the other day who said something I thought. Jim Leverton played with Steve Marriott. He was in Fat Mattress with Noel Redding and Caravan. And he said, you remember Ralph? I didn't really, because even at my age, I missed out a lot. But he said, music used to be important, and that was the most important thing, not its popularity, which is kind of a rose-colored, perhaps, you know, because obviously commerce was always a big part of the music industry. But that's how I felt when I think Shaken and Stirred. It was a guy who wasn't interested in anything other than moving forward. Again, a restlessness, which, you know, some of the songs, specifically songs like Too Loud, may not be to your taste, but I'm capable, and I think a lot of music listeners, if they're not, they should explore the idea of having two seemingly contrarian ideas of not liking something, but respecting something. And Shaken and Stirred is a classic album of, you know, you don't have to love every choice he made, and Too Loud, sorry, is the kind of puts a fine point on it. It's a pretty static song musically, doesn't do much musically. It brings in this guy, Victor. It's a strange philosophical, especially when you're 19, you're thinking, you're not necessarily thinking it's kind of the Crunge Part 2. Which is kind of a piss take perhaps on James Brown. And I didn't know where's that confounded bridge meant. Of course, later I knew that there's no bridge on the Crunge, and that's, you know, that was a joke. It was funny, and Too Loud to me struck me later as it's funny. It's just funny piece of, it's levity in the same way that the Crunge or Hot Dog or Jamaica or Boogie with Stu or any of those things that ran through Robert. So in that sense, I thought, okay, I can square that. It's not out of left field. It's just something that Robert does, as opposed to, you know, what is this weird dance, new wave crap? It's like, no, it's not that. It's something else. And Too Loud reminded me of Who Done It in that sense from Abacab, which people hated. Oh, why did they not put on You Might Recall or even Paper Late? Why did they put this awful sort of crappy pseudo punky? And right, again, maybe because I came to Genesis late, but to me, it was great. It was like, oh, this is totally different. Let's go here for 3 minutes and 15 seconds kind of thing. That's what I evolved into with Too Loud. So I do go on in my enthusiasm. But Tony was a key part of Robert's vision, and in many ways, this Shaken and Stirred almost feels like a Euro pop record, which again is, you could hear it kind of in Principle of Moments, not so much in Pictures at 11, but songs like Reckless Love and Stranger Here Over There, and maybe part of that was how Barrymore approached the rhythm on those songs, but they were very forward-thinking songs versus, say, Other Arms or Messing with the Mekon. Horizontal Departure, pretty forward tune. And I don't mean these in a pejorative sense, because Principal Moments, I share your enthusiasm for it. They're just great songs. But he certainly was going off. He was moving somewhere with those two Barry tunes. Anyway, so that kind of sums up in part why I love the record. So when I sit and listen to it, one of the things that mesmerizes me about this, and I encourage people to try and hear it through perhaps through this kind of thinking, is it's a record of duality. It's a deceptive record where it appears to be one thing, but it's actually another. And as I said, it's a record born out of tension, but you can't really hear that tension. You can occasionally feel it. It's kind of Robert obviously was enamored. He built his life on the blues. Shaken and Stirred is not a blues record. You'd be hard pressed, maybe with sixes and sevens. It's fairly absent. It's European. Another thing I love about it is largely feels like it's born in England and Europe, in dance clubs of Europe, or Ibiza, or exotic. It sounds exotic in places to me. At the same time, it sounds really progressive, English progressive rock, but yet lyrically, it's one of his most accessible records, but also some of his most poignant and direct lyrics. And me being a lyric guy, you don't often think about Robert in the same way you might think of, John Lennon or Roger Waters or Peter Gabriel, or you listen to Robert for his voice, for how he sings a line, but not necessarily, there are exceptions, but it's mostly how he sings those lines and how perfect, like the Beatles, how they could structure a line and marry it to a melody in this indelible way where you thought that guy is a great singer. But you didn't necessarily listen to Robert, as I said, in the same way you might listen to Roger, where it's like reading a book, where it hits you intellectually. And I thought this album has some tracks that crossed over into, it gets sixes and seven little by little, being two of them, to me, one of the more, or examples of his more poignant, direct. Yet the album itself sounds really quite, some might say disposable, but certainly, like I said, layered and pop. And there's all these sort of walls of artifice, one could say, and buried beneath all that is the lyrics. I don't see it that way. I see it as this duality. And I see the duality in the cover, as it's abstract looking. I mean, especially for like a heathen like me who doesn't know a whole lot about it. I know a bit more now, but at the time I thought, what is this? What does this even mean? It was abstract to me. Yet at the same time, I was drawn into it in a way that I didn't understand as a 19-year-old. It was curious to me. So that's the odd thing, is great art, even great abstract art, which appears on one level to be saying, I'm the artist and I'll do what I want and you can like it or not like it. But on another level, it's saying, I dare you to explore this. And that's what that cover did for me. It dared me to go, because he's not there. He's not on the cover. He's not saying, I'm a former front man, I'm a rock god, I'm a this, I'm a that. It's just saying, here's pretty colors and strange images and circles and lines and slabs of, I don't know, Martin, you'd be able to because you're an actual artist, but it had this strange duality of being abstract, yet wanting me to come in. And that's this record. It's immediate, while at the same time, just sometimes out of reach, which seems kind of nebulous. And I don't necessarily think everyone's going to understand what I'm talking about. But this was still to this day, that's how I feel. I'm in it, yet which is a really exciting. I mean, why do we listen to music? I mean, why do I can tell you why I listen to music to be challenged, but to feel something, not just nostalgia, not just, oh, I used to be 18 and now I'm in my 50s. But now I'm going to be 18 for 47 minutes. I listen to it to keep, before we started, I mentioned I started teaching myself German. I did that not just to learn a language, but to push my mind to turn the radio to a new frequency. And that's what that record is and remains 37 odd years later is a new set of stations, a new frequency. So again, it appears to be a pop album in many ways, but there's actually way more to it. Much like, again, I go back to Ritchie's drums, which have the sense of being, in many ways, I won't say straightforward, but part of a new wave kind of sonic menu, while at the same time being incredibly complicated. And again, Phil is one of the few drummers that I know who can make something. You listen to Turn It On Again, which I think is in 13/8 time. And although it's not that hard to play, once you master that, it's a complicated drum part compositionally. It took a musician, it took a really clever guy to come up with that. And that's what I hear with Ritchie. It's accessible, but at the same time, it's like, wow, there is so much going on in what he's doing, not just in how he's arranged what he's going to play, but obviously what he's doing. So Shaken and Stirred, to borrow from Principal Moments, is not a horizontal departure or a lateral move, but it's a vertical. It's a vertical departure.
Yeah.
All right. Just again, to touch a bit on Now and Zen, when I listen to Now and Zen, I do want to mention, interestingly enough, the only song that really moved me on Now and Zen, I bought the cassette of Now and Zen back then and the vinyl, but because back then that came out, I think in 80, I want to say 88.
Yeah. 88.
And the cassette gave you Walking Towards Paradise as a bonus track. And then I think the CD did as well. And that to me was the extension, that song, which was relegated to a B-side. It might've been a B-side of Heaven Knows. I can't remember. Maybe that was my first exposure, as I knew the single, the 45, you flipped it over, and, you know, like many music fans, you loved B-sides that didn't appear on albums. And it was a cover, interestingly, Walking Through Paradise. Is it toward or through? Doesn't matter. That to me was an extension of Shaken and Stirred. And I felt that excitement again when I heard that song. The rest of the record, as I said, was either looking too far in the back past or just doing. Of course, this isn't back then. Now and Zen again it's a great record, but it's no Shaken and Stirred. It's, even though popularity wise, and it seems like people think, oh, now he's found himself again. He's figured out a way to balance his past and his future again. Yeah, that record did not do that for me. It was like, you've ceased to be this progressive artist. So, again, Shaken and Stirred is a guy who's aware of his past, but doesn't trade on it. And I think that's a key point for someone who admires artists for developing new things, is if you're going to hint at the past, do it in a way that you just kind of slides into you through your fingernails or something as a listener and doesn't hit you. So, and now for the last 20 years or so, Robert has really slid into this idea, slid in the best sense of, I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm not competing anymore in the marketplace. Shaken and Stirred was a record where he was still competing in the marketplace. Obviously, the music industry was totally different then, but now he just puts out records. You love them, you don't love them. You're frustrated that they're sometimes angular or impenetrable, but it's a guy doing what he wants. And I love that. And I admire that. And if I had the money to do that, I would be putting out books of poetry and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Another thing I love about this album, which to me was largely absent, and again, this is my prog roots. I love concept albums, Lamb Lies Down on Broadway and Quadrophenia, and this may be a stretch to some people, but this came to me, I suppose, later on, 5 or 6 years later, and people may roll their eyes, but I see this as a concept album. But first of all, before I get into that, the other thing I love about this record is he didn't bury the lead, in the sense that he was going in a new direction, and he tells you right out of the bloody gate that this record is going to be up-tempo. It's going to involve textures and sounds and arrangements that are definitely pushing the envelope, unabashedly drawing on new wave and the technology. And side two, again, it's about this duality. Side two settles into a heavier, arguably more direct, with easily leads on there and 6s and 7s, little by little. It's something we're more comfortable with. Now, he could have top loaded that record with side two, where everyone went down and went, oh yeah, this is what I love. Little by little, that's, he doesn't do that. And back then, obviously, most people put on side one first. The other thing he did is he put Little by Little on side two. He didn't start with that song. I love that. I love the boldness of that. I love that you had to work to get to the familiar, which is a unique and admirable trait. And Robert, well, if you compare that to Principle of Moments, where he starts off that record with Other Arms, which is very familiar sounding. It's that's the nice warm blanket of Robert that we wrap ourselves in. And there's a break on Other Arms where Phil does some really kind of fancy footwork with his Ludwig speaking, which again conjures that Zeppelin-esque. I don't know whether he's doing triplets on that bass drum, like single-footed triplets on that bass drum, but it's very, first heard that, I thought, oh, I could see him doing an homage on Shaken and Stirred. All those kinds of concessions are off the table. It's like, this is what I am, this is what I'm doing, this is how I want to invite you in. Now, the concept of this is, again, in retrospect, so I started to feel this way probably in the early 90s. This reminded me of, again, not with a sense of nostalgia, but it reminded me of what my life was on the weekend. And so go with me on this, Martin. You put this record on, and it's immediately, as I said, it's brash and upbeat, and you can't help, may sound silly, but you can't help but be physically moving listening to that. Well, at the same time, the rhythm is jagged. Boom, 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 boom. So it doesn't let you settle in. puts you, it leaves you kind of askew. This is Hip to Who I'm talking about. But you can't help, I couldn't help but be invigorated at the same time, even though I couldn't clap to it or whatever. And that's how often I felt when I would start my day as a kid, as a guy in his late teens, early 20s, is that you're raring to go, but life isn't that simple, but you want to embrace it. And so that, to me, I imagine that record as a story of a guy, because it is male music. It may not be now, but to me back then, I didn't know, save for one friend of mine in college, this woman, Franca, and even when she was into Robert Plant, but not in the same way that I was. Anyway, I don't want to get too far afield. It reminded me again. So that's how you start your day. Maybe it's Saturday, you're feeling up, but you're just, because you're uncomfortable in your own skin, it reflects that. But you're looking forward to the evening, because the evening is going to be finally a good evening where you're going to have fun, maybe meet someone, and all the rest of it. And you follow that side one. Again, these are in very general terms, in terms of moods. But by the time you get to Too Loud, you're actually at whatever bar or club. And you're probably talking too loud, and you probably had too many drinks, but you're still really up. So side one always struck me as that, the optimism of the day on the weekend, going right through to the end of side one, where you're now at the bar and you're determined to have a good time, but things are starting to revert back to how your life actually is, which is rarely as exciting as you want it to be. And then you turn the record over and you get into Little by Little, which is a very introspective tune about it. That song could be about the collapse of his marriage. He could have been conjuring the loss of his son, Carrick. Could be about trying to shake Zeppelin, which I'll get to. Could be about a lot of things, but it's introspective. It's I can breathe, the refrain of I can breathe again. It's thoughtful, is what I'm saying, which is, if you were me in the mid 80s going out, you always hit this wall where the night wasn't going the way you want. Maybe you went outside and hung out with your friends who smoked, and you kind of commiserated about that. And that side two slides into, by the time you get to Sixes and Sevens, you've devolved into life. Life will never work out for me. Not to put too fine a point on it. Life is, to borrow from perhaps Buddha, life is suffering. Life is misery, and maybe, easily led is an interesting placement. I think some of us probably, when they went on these bar crawls, had one night stands that were never satisfying or were in the most ephemeral way. And no matter what, you couldn't escape the fact that Sixes and Sevens was going to return you to how you felt just as you started your day, that life was hard. So that, to me, is the arc of that record. Confusion, melancholy giving way to elation, and optimism given then to dance club partiness, and really not trying to be someone else, into introspection, and then finally realization that it takes a whole lot more than a night out to shed all your vulnerabilities and insecurities. That's what I get from that record, which might strike people as what? But that's what I draw on. But just to finish up, so it's a concept album, not of a strict narrative, but of a concept album of shifting, swinging moods, youth, frustration, optimism fading into recognition that life isn't so easy to change. So finally, I just want to talk a bit about why you should listen to this fabulous album from a song point of view. Some of it you've heard, like Hip to Who. Again, it's not only got Tony Halliday front and center, And it's got Richie exploring these textures, percussion textures. But what sets this record apart too, for if you're a bass player, I mean, earlier I talked about Richie, but if you're a bass player or you love the bass, so you don't even have to be a player. I'm not a bass player, but I love the bass. You know, I can listen to Joe Tex, or I can listen to the Faces, or I can listen to any myriad of bands. I don't play the bass, but that's one of the elements I key into. And Shaken and Stirred remains absolutely revelatory in terms of bass playing. It is a beautiful, I can't think of enough superlatives. The Germans would say it was wunderbar. And, you know, I mentioned earlier that I interviewed Paul, who didn't really remember too much about this record. But I said, how did you get that bass sound? You must have done something different beyond the addition of Tim and Jez and a different jamming. And he said, well, I changed my pickups in my Fender bass. I used EMGs because they were brighter and more direct. And I thought, and just hearing that piece of information, like, oh. So as any musician knows, or an adjunct to a musician, whenever you change your equipment and you're the same guy, but you're producing a different sound, it boosts your ego, or your confidence rather, and just tenfold. Even when I play the drums. So if I had bought a new snare, or you know, I not too long ago bought a timbali, and you suddenly you're the same guy, but you're playing it and a new sound is coming. All of a sudden you're doing different stuff. And when Paul told me he had changed the sound of his bass, it clicked for me. That's in part why it sounds so fantastic. As he knows he sounds fantastic, he's trying something else. And on that song, you also get the real sense of Paul and Richie locking into each other. They do some neat just ensemble playing on that, just the way that song is structured. I can't really sing it to you. And the other thing about it is, and I talked about this earlier, is how this record was mixed, is the stereo picture, where everything is. It's not only so vivid and wide, but it's very clever. And again, with Hip to Who, I want to talk about Robbie Blunt in a moment, but he does these sort of stabbing rhythm parts. And if you're sitting there, especially on headphones or a good set of speakers that can really, where you can, you know, totem speakers are really good at that, the imaging. And the guitar sits around here. I don't know if you can see that. When you're listening to it, it's in this weird, where you got to go, what is that? But again, it's just so inspiring, but meticulously thought out. Stereo pictures, I know a lot of people love mono or narrow stereo. I'm a guy who loves exploring what stereo means. And this, again, this is an audiophile's dream, this record. Luckily, when it's made it to CD, it's been pretty sympathetic. It hasn't been too butchered, but that original vinyl grows with whatever system you get. The better your system, the more extraordinary. You know, some records, when you improve your stereo, reveal their limitations. Shaken and Stirred, like the second Midger album, Answers to Nothing, it challenges your stereo to be better. It just gets better and better and more enveloping and more. So kudos to that production team. And that's why that record doesn't sound dated, because bloody great sounding music shall never date, in my mind. The other thing about Hip to Who specifically that I loved, which I thought, again, I urge people not to dismiss this record, is it tells you that Robbie Blunt, who was such a huge part of those first two records, a lot of slide guitar, a lot of just heavy guitar. You can listen to Slow Dancer or listen to Worse Than Detroit, or this was a different guy. And I'd heard even back then that Robert and Robbie fought over Jez and Robert wanting him to use a Roland guitar synthesizer, like pushing him, like they pushed Richie. Like Robert and Jez seem to be the only guys, and Paul seem to be the only guys completely comfortable with, okay, new tools, new sounds. But the great thing always, and you hear musicians complain about this, oh, I had to use this, or they made me do this, but they uncover sounds that you never heard before. And Robbie's guitar solo on Hip to Who, even when I was grumpy 19-year-old, I thought, what is that sound he's got on his lead? This kind of weird, wiry, I couldn't even figure out what that was. It wasn't distortion. It wasn't reverb. It was this snaky, and maybe that is a Roland. I don't really know. I'm not schooled in being able to pick out a Roland guitar synthesizer. I thought it was like a synthesizer. I don't know what he's doing, but it was unlike anything he had done before, that sound. And again, it's the first song. It's Robert saying, you know what? Everything you think of me, you're not going to get. And how could that not be exciting? And I'm going to put this as the first track on the record. So that excited me. Again, Kalaloo, I think it's pronounced. For me, that song is about Richie again. It's this Iowa guy who is in a Southern band, although I don't even know if Little Feat is Southern. That's a terrible assumption.
California.
American band.
California.
Not that they weren't, as I said, extremely progressive, but here you get a sense that this guy can do what Phil did, not actually play like Phil, but explore like Phil did, but he sounds like Stuart Copeland, he sounds like Omar Hakim, he sounds like himself. And this is another track that I just think, man, say what you want about Robert, and this has borne itself out. He always has had great drummers, always. And the fact that John Bonham's passing, that's what he took away. If I'm going to make music, I got to chase John Bonham. And I'll never find John Bonham again, but I'm going to find players that are intensely lyrical, musical, innovative, fearless, who just can get inside a song. And that was Richie. And I love Michael Lee, and I loved a lot of the players since. But certainly as I got older, this record made me go back and buy some Little Feat albums to hear that guy outside the context. So Trouble Your Money is another song. Again, I'm not going to go through every song, but I say a lot of this to encourage people to listen to it. Trouble Your Money, the lyrics. So when I wake every night, it's the same, just lying there staring and confused yet again. It's when I do that, I fumble in the dark for the line or the light from the tear in my heart. Again, maybe Robert has, All My Love is pretty explicit lyric, but to me, that was revelatory in terms of his writing as being completely hard on your sleeve and completely mirroring just not what it is to be a 20-year-old, but to be a 55-year-old. Because that's all you do as you get older. There's this grand myth as you get older, and unless you've been very lucky, or I wouldn't even say you're wealthy, but you've got, let's just say, fewer issues, you never ever lose the sense of lying there and staring confused again. That's a timeless lyric to me from the pen of Robert. Not really known. He's known for Every Inch of My Love and mining J.R.R. Tolkien and stuff like that. Here, he's as good as anybody. And that's what this record is. And you also heard it in 10 Years Gone from Physical Graffiti, I think, which is ostensibly about one of his first great loves. But it's a uniquely confessional record. And you wouldn't think about a Robert Plant record as confessional, but in retrospect, again, that's why I love it. Yeah. And of course, even if you don't care about that stuff, Trouble Your Money has an unbelievable drum part where Richie brings in timbales and he sounds like Stuart Copeland on. It sounds a bit like the song Regatta de Blanc, how he uses the rim and all the rest of it. Fantastic. Little by little, I want to mention this. It's a commercial tune. Obviously, it was his biggest hit from this album, but my God, listen to the bass playing. The bass playing is astounding. It's buoyant, yet it's loping, and it's sinewy, and it's melodic, and the choices and the places Paul goes. To me, it's a defining moment in terms of arrangement and playing on this record. So yeah, it's a great song, fabulous song, but the bass playing is unlike anything I've heard on Robert. And it reminds me, again, and I don't do this as a disservice or out of laziness, but I had Ramble On the other day. And the bass playing on that is so busy without ever being, it again treads the line of being groove and then busy, and groove and then busy. And this song, it takes that to another level. It's just, if anyone listens to this tape, just try and listen to that bass line. In university, I took a jazz class, and I don't remember most of it, but one of the first things Professor Hartwig said was, if you want to listen to music, you listen to the song, and then what you do is you do your best to figure out what instruments are on that song. And however many instruments are on that song, you listen to the song that many times. And each time you put it on, you hone in on one instrument or one harmony or one, and that forever changed my life and how I listen to music. And that's what I do. Even if a song wasn't really reaching me, I'd say, okay, I can hear a distorted guitar, or I can hear a harmony part. I'm just going to listen to that. And then at the end of that process, you put it all together. And I guarantee you, it changes how you listen to music. And little by little, again, great song. The bass part is the best part. But again, the lyric, Robert, little by little, my heart grieves. Little by little, I call your name. Little by little, my tears flow. Everything changes. Isn't that true? I don't know. It's not sort of this bromide. It's profound. Again, I don't necessarily attach Gabriel and Dylan and Roger Waters and Springsteen and to profundity. Lennon. So to encounter that kind of simple profundity, like all you need is love, this is a darker. And then he ends that with the air clears, I can breathe again. So again, I talked a bit about being young, and you have no choice, even in your darkest moments, Lord willing, but to move forward. Little by little, you move forward. The air clears. And the other thing about Shaken and Stirred, I'm sorry, I'm just touching everything on this because I love this album so much, is there's a Greg Lake album called Maneuvers that came out in 83. Again, it died a death. Chrysalis didn't support it. People didn't like it. It wasn't ELP. It was crap kind of thing. And I was 17 and I bought that record, and it was revelatory for me because I'd never heard Greg sing so well as I did on that record. And Shaken and Stirred embraces, or he uses everything that made him great, but he's just a much more mature singer in his ability to convey emotion and shifts in emotion and shifts in mood. He's peaking to me as a performer, as a singer. Easily Led, again, great vocal, probably in my mind, the heaviest tune. Great lead guitar part, Robbie popping back in to say, I'm still that guy. But again, that's part of that side too, which I think is the more conventional side, considerably more conventional. And I don't use that as a pejorative. It's just another side of Robert's peerless artistry. And finally, sixes and sevens. And I don't know if people know that. Most people know this. First of all, I talk about this disillusionment of a day, and sixes and sevens, which I think is English slang for meaning out of sorts, not knowing, confusion, or I looked it up once. Knowing that in that Englishman kind of way, he's borrowing from something that I would have to work at as a Canadian to understand what that means, which again, I love that kind of stuff. And yeah, that's been in his approach. He doesn't necessarily explicitly tell you what the title means always. And this song might have the most beautifully recorded buzz roll I think I've ever heard. In the mid part of the song, Richie just lays out this, and it lasts about 3/4 of a second. But I talk about the bass part, and little by little, that not just being about playing an arrangement, but how it was recorded, what instrument was being used. That moment in sixes and sevens, the way Richie turns the snare drum into something that is liquefied to me. It's absolutely, the jaw drops. And if you don't listen carefully, it goes right by you, which is a shame, because that's a player. That is a bloody player. Anyway, but it's ostensibly a new wave record, a pop record, and he leaves you with the closest thing I think you get to the blues, though it's not blues in my mind. But it leaves us, so sundown, another busy day, watching the time fly, old ground, staring in the way, and I don't know why. So here I'm making changes, alterations to my house of cards, but I don't hold new arrangements. Am I at home? Am I at home? Am I all right? Look down almost with breath held as the time flies. I found I'm lost in your reflection, and I don't know why. It's this. He leaves you not only with a state of heaviness, not just musically, but emotional heaviness, and a plea. I found that. He says, talk to me. It gets so hard. Just a little bit hard when you talk to me like you do, just a little bit. Anyway, it's like a plea for support. It may be support in his head. It may be those around him. Doesn't matter. It's something that is universal. You always need a hand. You always need a hug. You always need to not be alone, unless you want to be. So again, for a record that to some was called disposable or slick or artificial, he bloody well lays it out. And again, it's that duality. It's light and it's heavy. It's slick, but it's authentic. It's myriad of colors, yet you can't escape the fact that there's a lot of grays and blacks that you may not see on this cover, but it's all over the record. If you listen to it, it's work. And sixes and sevens is blues only by virtue of you can feel it, even if it balks at convention. It's not I'm Gonna Crawl, and it's not T for One, and it's not Since I've Been Loving You. It's something else. Robbie isn't doing a long extended slide solo or there's a weird sound soloing. It sounds like Jez playing some sort of, I don't know if it's a Fairlight or some weird, a Jupiter. I don't know. I'm not a keyboard guy. But he's choosing to convey this moment of imbalance and melancholia in a way that turns his back on what he used to do. So anyway, to sum up, I don't know if I can sum that up, because to me, there's so much to this, but it's a beautifully produced melodic album with a singer at the height of his game, with a lyricist bearing in a way that I hadn't heard him before through a whole album. It's an album that swings ferociously through emotions. It's ballsy because, yeah, he's got Tony Holiday and he's got, he lets his keyboard player full on embrace technology, but never, for me anyway, we're all different, but never in a way that feels cloying or feels like a cash in. To me, again, the ultimate cash in was he chucked this album. You know, I don't remember how much he did on the Now and Zen tour of this record, Beyond Little by Little, but it became one of those records like Wings, Back to the Egg, or, you know, there's always records in people's catalogs that for the most part never deserve Richard and Linda Thompson, First Light, that are consigned to the dustbin when really they never should have been. It was only old opinions and I talked to you about this a lot, Martin, and certainly Final Cut was an example. Where you are, where you land with someone, with an artist. You know, if you were born in 1950 and you were 19, and I'm stereotyping because I know not everyone's like this, and you bought the Brown record or you bought Led Zeppelin 3 on your 20th birthday, this may seem alien to you, but I landed with Robert on Pictures at 11. I landed through the lens of Duke and Wind and Wuthering, and just like I landed with Yes on 90125. I hadn't with Final Cut as well, no baggage. And I always challenge people, especially older guys I meet, you know, at music shows or just through my work. And they're like, even if they're not doing this, they have this aura of this, which is, I like the old stuff. And I pity that. Because we all got to change. Everything changes, as he says. You can either go, I'm not going to change, I just want what I want, or you can go, no. And this is, again, I leave it with this. I don't understand people who cherry pick records because it's never been my thing. I either love a writer or I don't. So, and when you're a Beatle fan, that's what you learn immediately. You love the artist. And no, you're not going to love every song because that's nigh on impossible, although there isn't a Beatles song I don't love. But for the most part, I don't get it. And obviously being a Genesis fan and weathering these, or being a fan of The Who post-Moon, weathering these ridiculous arguments of it's not the same anymore. That's the point. That's the point. You listen to It's Hard or Face Dances, and anyway, lyrically, he goes to places that are completely connected with what he was always doing, completely exploring these things from a different point of view. There's been death, there's been change, you listen to Shaken and Stirred the same way. A lot happened from 77 when his son died, to 1984 when he was putting this record together for an 85 release. So much changed. And that's, if you love the guy as an artist, wow, is that a huge amount of psychic energy to transmute into art that is a gift to us. And that's what Shaken and Stirred is to me. It's a bloody gift.
Very cool, man.
That's the end of my long rant about Shaken and Stirred. I'm sure
nice.
There's other things that I could go on, but you know, I hope I've at least made a case that I don't even know why this would be a contrarian record, yet I know completely why it's a contrarian record.
Yes, that was great. That was awesome. And I'll just add a couple of points and end on a light note. You're right. I mean, there was a lot of there were definitely a lot of albums that actually, you know, and this is credit to Robert too, because a lot of people love Fate of Nations. A lot of people like Mighty Arranger a lot, and of course, you know, we both bond over Principle of Moments as well. This album does definitely come in pretty low on people's lists, and I wanted to go check. You know, your point you just made about this album being tossed aside and how much of it did he play. When you look at the set list stats, oddly, you know, the songs, as you said earlier on, the songs by the end of his career now are that he played the most are Zeppelin songs. So he plays a lot of Zeppelin songs. Then you start mixing in some of his bigger hits, like "In the Mood" is his second most played song ever. "Tall Cool One" is number 6 out of you're down to out of the top 14, there are literally 2 Robert Plant solo songs in what he plays the most. There's a lot of Zeppelin songs, but to find anything from this album, you go all the way down to number 52 for "Little by Little." He's played that like 81 times. "Pink and Black" has been played. That goes down to number 89. "Too Loud" down to 127. So very little from this definitely was played live. But yes, you definitely look at the stats and your point you just made also just recently about the whole thing with people's opinions being ossified and you're really just thinking about your old opinion of it. That has landed, I think, across, any of the places that I kind of checked with ratings where, Ultimate Classic Rock has it at the bottom of 15 and it brings up "Little by Little," of course, right? "Return of Rock" leaves it out of a top 10. Best Ever Albums has Fate of Nations highest. Mighty Arranger is rated actually high as well. Now and Then gets rated pretty high too. But I just wanted to end, and by the way, that was amazing. This is, again, just the same way you talked about Final Cut and the Peter Gabriel. This is probably the greatest breakdown analysis of this album that anybody's going to ever really attempt, because it is a very maligned album. And also, again, with our Patreon subscribers, Tim Derling rated it a 3 out of 10, but he does mention its lush eeriness. And he goes, "I still remember Rick Dees playing it on Top 40 and making some sort of quip about Dristan in response to his line, 'I can breathe again.'" But we've got David Gallagher rates it a 3 out of 10. John Clauser's got it a 4. Todd Evans got it a 2. Don the Chaldeans got it a 1. But I wanted to end on a light note, because this was a fond memory of mine when I got to meet the Little Feat guys and drive who was it Fred Teckett to find a Chinese restaurant and all this. But sitting on the bus with them at one point, I started to talk to Richie about it. And I said to him, I interviewed Jez the other day. He goes, "Hey, how's he doing? I heard he was sick." He just did a CD of swing versions of Led Zeppelin classics. This was around that time. And Richie goes, "Strange boy. He got a bunch of money and he built a studio in London years ago, and they came and stole all his stuff. So he got the insurance money, bought all the stuff again, and they came and stole all his stuff." This is like 87 or 88. Paul Barriere goes, "That's like Monty Python." And Richie goes, "We'll build this castle in the sand." He's a really nice guy, Jez, but he's got the luck of Job. Then we're talking about this album. I go, "Tell me about your experience with Shaken on Stirred." He goes, "Well, Robert, in 1983, he wanted to be modern." This is kind of a jokey little passage that he kind of goes through. And some of these things I'm not sure is he's got completely right. And like you say, God bless. We lost Richie recently, right? Yeah. But he goes, in 83, he wanted to be modern. He wouldn't touch any of his roots or when where he came from or to any Zepp songs. He wanted to be modern, and I wanted to rock. Well, I guess what you had to go on the evidence, those first two albums was totally different to one you were working on. Yeah, exactly. But all the guys in the band were great. It was a deep culture shock living in England and being the only Yank in the band. But as we started to progress into this record after rehearsals and everything, Kenny Gradney says, "Did they treat you like a Yank?" Richie says, because we're all sitting on the bus. So there's like 4 of us here. Richie goes, "They treated me good. It started to grow on me like a wart." No, it was good. It was a lot of fun. Benji Lefebvre was getting really good drum sounds, and it was a lot of fun to do. So let's see. Did you have? So I asked about the analog drums and the mix of the Simmons. He goes, "Yeah, there were 5 Simmons I had mixed in with the kit. I had to incorporate them somehow to make Robert think we were being modern. So I tried to get modern." Paul Barriere goes, "Hence the term modern drummer." And I go, "And Robbie Blunt hated that album too, right?" And he goes, "Well," he laughs. He looks down at my tape recording and he turns it off. He goes, Paul, and then Paul goes, actually, before he turns it off, Paul goes, "Have you stopped being your wife?" And Richie goes, "I've stopped having a wife." Kenny goes, "You went from wife to life." Richie, "I went from God to cod. There was some stress on the record. Can I shut that off?" And he goes, "I don't care." And then, but we do turn it off. And he does mention, he goes, Robert went on some sort of clandestine trip to America, and he wouldn't tell anybody what it was for. It turned out it was for the Honey Drippers EP of the 1950s covers. And when he came back, he took all the songwriting, which isn't true. Like you went through, and when I saw this again preparing for this, you're right. Robert was very good with the credits. The credits are very egalitarian, as you say, right? And then Richie told me this was all with a tape recorder. He goes, I made $11 on that record. And he goes, he then alluded, this is me writing my notes to myself when I was doing this. He then alluded to some sort of story that management offered him £25,000 if the album went platinum. And then Paul joked, that it was that the record probably was at 999,000 copies at this point. You know, the whole we don't have to pay him out. So that was kind of interesting. It was like it sounds like he wasn't paid very well to do it, but there was some sort of thing. Oh, if it goes platinum, you'll get a bunch of money, right? But then tape recorder back on. Richie goes, we were playing huge places, the Forum, and what's that big hat box in Dallas? Anyways, the big hat box in Dallas, lots of stuff like that. I mean, he's not used to seeing empty seats, so it would be like 10% short of the sellout, and he would get depressed. Then I mentioned of Jez said on the previous tour that they had flown around on a little private plane. And then Richie goes, yeah, Ahmet Ertgun loaned us his G1. And then I guess Mo Austin wanted to use it or something. So we got a propeller version of the same plane. That was the only time I've ever been on a private plane. It was nice. Let's see. I asked him, was Robert fairly quick and efficient? Could he get takes quickly? Yeah. Did he dress up the studio or anything? He goes, no lava lamp, no nothing. It was the room they recorded Dr. Pepper in, Sergeant Pepper in. And then Paul goes, they drank Dr. Pepper when they recorded Sergeant Pepper. Yes, but it all had to be redone. It was in Kensington or something. I couldn't find it now if I had to. Then I go, did you see any friction with Robbie having to do the songs live? Yeah, sometimes. But what I remember most was Jez on the tour because he was so gullible. It was funny. Like we got off the plane in Phoenix and he looked at the sand and he said, where's the beach? And we pointed west, it's way over there. And Benji told him in Australia that there were these special kinds of weird animals in Australia called drop bears. They were like koalas, but they were really violent. And they would drop out of trees on tourists and beat the shit out of them. And Kenny goes, and don't go in the pool at night because there's an alligator in it, Richie. Yeah. And in Japan, we had him walking up and down the length of the bullet train at 170 miles an hour looking for the bath car. Like, sure, there's going to be a bath car in a train going 170 miles an hour. Big laughs all around. But we were in the club car and he went the length of the train and he came back and said, I couldn't find it. And I said, yeah, man. Robbie called him Toby because he had a thing about Jez. And he said, yeah, it's there, man. You missed it. Go again. He did it 3 times. So yeah, fun times on the bus with little feet, but pretty cool. And yeah, got him to sign I couldn't find my old Jez interview. But I don't think I asked him very much about this because I was it was actually, we were talking for my Sabbath book, but I definitely asked him a little bit about the previous album, which I'm in such awe at, but yeah, there you go.
I just want to throw in 3 very quick things.
Okay.
The songwriting credits about Robert's, anyone who's in this industry, be it film, television, music, when you're recognized financially, because it's a long, hard road for any artist, writer, etc. When your boss says, you know what, I'm going to give you the credit. And I'm not sure the timeline. Paul Martinez, when I interviewed him, he couldn't really tell me at what point he had that conversation. But he certainly enthused about when Robert made that decision to be open about discussing credits and then saying to Paul, you put your name on the things that you feel you contributed to. And we'll go with that. Yeah. That completely changes your attitude about work. I've worked with some people in the film industry who just hated to give you credit, not only because they had to pay you for that, but because their egos were the size of Greenland. And it made working conditions that much harder. Yeah. Secondly, when I think of Shaken and Stirred, I think of, and you'll hate me for this because I talk about Paul McCartney a lot because he's one of my heroes. But you listen to Back to the Egg, which was the last and only record he did with that specific lineup with Steve Hawley and Lawrence Juber, and Linda and Denny. And you listen to that record and you wish there had been more. You wish he hadn't split that band. That's what I feel when I listen to Shaken and Stirred. Could we have just not had one more with this lineup, with this sound? Did we have to go back and bring in Jimmy Page and bring in a bunch of kids? So I think Phil Johnston and all those guys were much younger. It's like, damn it. And the last thing, one of the last things I want to say is when I look at the Honey Drippers now, I acknowledge that that was probably a palate cleanser for him. That was probably gave him the artistic space to do something like Shaken and Stirred. That whole on journey into nostalgia ricocheted him to being incredibly forward thinking. Jellyfish is another band. They only did 2 records, and the last record they did was called Spilt Milk. It came out, I think, 29 years ago. And I still listen to that record, much like Shaken and Stirred, saying, why couldn't you have done more? Why? Whatever you had created, again, Robert, Jez, Paul, Robbie, Tony, why couldn't you have just given me at least one more? And that's the feeling you want to be left with an album, is I want more. I want more of this. And I want more abstract. You know, I don't want the mullet. I don't want Jimmy Page. You know, it doesn't take me, because if you give me Jimmy Page, you'll never compete with the Rover or Out on the Tiles, or you'll never do it. And they never did it. And if you look at, Shaken and Stirred through, again, I talked about this, but Manic Nirvana and Now and Zen, I mean, in there is Fate of Nations, right? Which was kind of half nostalgia and half he's using new people. But there was it harkened back. And then what does he do? He gets with Page, and there's a lot of that project, the Unleaded project, I like. But I thought, for me as a Plant fan, it felt like, geez, now it's been 10 years since he's done something where he's pushing forward. Because the Page Plant project, even the album they did, which has really grown on me, felt like this is a sidewalk I've walked down many, many times. I'd never been down this boulevard, and he never took me down there again. That's a drag.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Very cool. All right, guys. Well, there you go. That's an amazing look at Shaken and Stirred. Let us know in the comments below what you guys think. I am going to urge, when I share this, to stick with us through it, because it definitely is one of our longest episodes.
And here I wouldn't have enough material.
No, but it was great. It was amazing. So thanks again to Ralph. Go listen to some Shaken and Stirred and let us know what you think. Bye for now.
Headphones, good headphones.
Yes, good headphones. Exactly.
Like
all right.
$5 minimum.
Yeah. All right. See you guys later. Go listen to some Shaken and Stirred.